Welcome back to the Noble Forms video tutorial series. Hi, I'm Richard Noble, the founder of Noble Forms. If you have any questions about these videos, please feel free to call me at 503-635-6235. I'm always available to answer questions. These videos will show you how to prepare a complete estate plan for a hypothetical client, John and Jane Jones. And this particular video is going to show you how to prepare the asset spreadsheet and the funding documents. To start the assembly of the asset spreadsheet and the funding documents, navigate to the Funding Fee and Explanatory Material app. Then click Review or Update. Then click the arrow next to Documents and select the Trust Spreadsheet and the Trust Funding Documents. When you do that, the interview is going to change and it's going to ask you questions that pertain to those two templates. And you'll see that because you have selected the trust funding documents, there is going to be some additional questions about the real estate, which you might not have seen when you were working earlier with the assets and the asset spreadsheet, or perhaps in the client interview where we talked about the assets also. You could produce these documents separately, but here we're going to produce them together. And this might be kind of a common approach. You've already gathered a bunch of information from the clients about the assets. You have obtained a trio for each of the pieces of real estate that's going to be put into the trust. So you have information about the legal description, which you're going to need for the funding documents. A lot of the questions have already been answered. The date the letter is signed will be new because you haven't talked about letters. These are the letters that are going to be produced in the funding documents template. And you would just pick the date that the trust documents are going to be signed. Client information, children, other important people, trustee designations, all the same. Now, asset information is pretty much filled out at this point, although you're going to have to go through each one and make sure you've answered the questions. If you don't answer a question, the document that's produced is going to have information missing, and you'll have to go back and run it again. So let's just go down the list, and we'll just start at the real estate. Although one thing I want to go back and emphasize, before you do that, go back to other important people and make sure that with respect to especially the financial institutions, that the addresses have been filled in by either you or by the client. So if you look, for instance, we clicked on Chase Bank and scroll down, and we see that there is address information. That's good. If there isn't address information, when the letters are produced, they're not going to be correct because they won't have the address. The address is actually produced inside of each of the letters. So that's so you want to just check that. If you do produce a document and things are missing, you're just going to have to go back, review other important people, and provide the information about the address that maybe wasn't provided. So if we start and we look at the real estate, again, a lot of this is going to already be there. But what's different now, and if this is the first time you've prepared the spreadsheet, you'll see that there's an additional question here on the right-hand side. You've already answered, or the client answered, and you've verified how the asset is currently owned. And in this case, the client might have told you that they own the house together, but you would have got a trio from a title company, which is going to show exactly how the clients took title as husband and wife, or tenants by the entirety, or maybe it's owned by one or of the spouses. And so based upon the information that you got from the trio, from the title company, you would select the appropriate, how is this asset currently owned? And just to remember that this spreadsheet isn't necessarily just used where you're doing a new trust for a client. This also can be used to update a client. Like if a client comes back 3 or 4 years from now and you open up this interview, you can go back and at this point, maybe you have, when you set up the trust, you retitled the house in the name of the trust. So in that case, how is the asset currently owned wouldn't be John and Jane jointly, it would have been their joint trust. And then you'd get a spreadsheet and funding documents that would match the current ownership of the assets. But here, since John and Jane are new clients, everything they own is either owned jointly, or it's owned by John individually, or by Jane individually. But what's different now in the interview, what's new in the interview, is the question, how will this asset be owned in the future? And here, in this case, since they're doing a joint trust, we'd like the primary residence to be owned by the joint trust. Now, if this were a two-trust plan, you could title it so half in John's trust and half by Jane's trust. But here we're going to pick John and Jane's joint trust. And then we just kind of go review the information. All of this should be filled in about the loan balance, the value, the address of the property, the lender information, the insurance company information. But what is new here when we're doing the asset spreadsheet, well, actually when we're doing the funding documents, if you were just doing the asset spreadsheet, you wouldn't be asked the question about the deed because the deed isn't produced when you produce the spreadsheet. It's only produced when you run the funding letters template. So here you have some choices, typically warranty deed. The question is, the legal description will be, you can be either included in the body of the deed or attached as Exhibit A, just depending on how long the legal description is. And regardless of where it's going to be, you would type the legal description here. And you get this legal description from the trio, from the last deed, the vesting deed, the deed that the clients took title under. And then the answer to the question of the deed parcel number and the deed tax lot number would be from the report from the title company as part of the trio report. It would have this information. The next question is, the deed will be returned from recording to, and you have either the attorney or the client. Probably a better practice is to have it returned to the attorney so you can verify that in fact it did get recorded. Or if there's a problem with the deed, sometimes the recorder will send the deed back with an explanation that there's something wrong and it has to be changed or resubmitted. Then with grantor description, the grantor description would be obtained from the trio. You'd look at the deed, the last vesting deed, and see how the clients took title. And you write it exactly like it's in the deed. Now notice in this case, we're doing the grantor description, John Jones, not John A. Jones, because that's how they did it. You have to have it exactly the same. So John Jones and Jane A. Jones, and on the deed it said husband and wife. It could have said tenants by the entirety. In that case, you would have typed tenants by the entirety. And then the next question is, what's the name for the first signature? Well, it would be exactly like they took title. So in this case, the first signature would be John Jones, no middle initial. And then the second signature, based again on the deed, would be Jane A. Jones. Now the template knows how to produce the deed to put the house into the trust. It knows who the grantee is going to be. It knows it's the trustees of their trust and knows exactly how their names are set out in the trust agreement. You don't have to type that in. And then the notary information, would just be, obvious, the day, in this case, the day that the documents are going to be signed, the trust agreement. It's important to remember when you're answering the questions in the interview that you make sure that you're at the bottom of the page. So here, if we scroll down, we see there's one more question, and that's the county in which the real estate is located. Now, just going back up here for a minute and talking more about these deeds. In this case, the type of real estate is the primary residence, and it's in Oregon. And the template knows that it is going to produce a deed for this asset, putting the property into the ownership of the trust. We've said it's going to be in the joint trust. And what's going to be produced by the funding documents is a deed. And that's because there's a federal law that prohibits a lender from invoking the due on sale clause in a mortgage or trust deed where the property in question is the primary residence. You'll see here in a minute in a real property where it's not the primary residence, that even though we would say that we want to have the asset owned in the future by the joint trust, the template isn't going to produce a deed. It's going to produce a letter to the lender asking permission to put the property into the trust because the client's afraid that the lender might invoke the due on sale clause. So let's say okay to this one and go and look at personal property. So we're just going to go down the list here and kind of review the assets. The personal property, a new question is the notary is going to be signing the assignment of personal property in which Oregon county. Oregon, actually, it'll probably be blank. They might not even have the state. I think so. If you haven't done it, you'd have to pick the state where the assignment's going to be executed and pick the county for the notary. And what's produced here for personal property is an assignment of personal property. That's produced by the funding letters template. Here's some property, a real property over in Seaside. And now this is not primary residence. This is a vacation home. And John owns it individually, and we'd like to have it put into John and Jane's joint trust. However, there is a mortgage on it. And the information is here about the lender and the address of the lender. And if for this particular asset, because it's not the primary residence, the document that's produced in the funding documents is going to be a letter to the lender asking permission to put the property, to deed the property into the trust because they're afraid the lender might invoke the due on sale clause. One other note, if this real property is located in another state, again, you would say that you'd like to have that property be put into the trust. But again, the template's going to inform the client that they can't do that. Here, they're going to have to get an attorney in the state in which the property is located to do the deed. Then we just go through all the accounts, and all the accounts that are non-retirement accounts are going to go into the ownership of the trust, and we've got all the information on each of them, all the different accounts. The timeshare, what's produced is a letter to the management company for the timeshare asking them to let us know what paperwork has to be done so that the timeshare can be owned by the trust. Stock certificates, these are kind of a real pain. These are the shares of stock. They're not actually a brokerage account, but many people have them registered with ComputerShare. And so you have to ask ComputerShare what paperwork they have in order to make the trust the owner of the certificates of stock. Safety deposit box, a letter is produced to the financial institution asking them to retitle the safety deposit box in the ownership of the trust. With respect to the automobiles, there's a page is produced that informs the client that they should retitle their cars, go to DMV and retitle the cars in the name of the trust. Sometimes people don't do that because they think they're going to sell the car, they're not going to own it that long. They don't want to incur the extra expense of having to pay DMV to retitle the property. But the client would be advised that in the future, when they purchase new automobiles, they should title them in the name of the trust. This particular hypothetical has got a lot of properties that maybe wouldn't be in the typical client case, but it's just added here so you can see what would happen. So with like these airplanes, you'd have to go through whatever registration process is required to retitle an airplane. Non-qualified annuity, they typically aren't put in the ownership of the trust. They have beneficiary designations. The stock options, again, you'd have to consult with the company that issued them and see if it's possible to put them in the ownership of the trust. Contract would be a promissory. If somebody had promised to pay the client and what's produced as a letter to the borrower informing them that they should make payments to the trust. A business, it depends on the type of business, but the client's given information about, for instance, on an LLC, going online with the corporation division and making their trust the member of the LLC. This depends on what type of business it is. The insurance policy, now these typically the ownership stays in the individual who owns it, but a letter is produced to the insurance company that tells them who the beneficiary should be. And the client is told that when they get a letter from the insurance company that has the correct beneficiary designation on it, that they should insert that letter in the 3-ring binder behind the file copy of the letter that was produced. And you'll see, and we'll show you later, that when these letters are produced, in addition to the letter, which is actually signed by the client, there is also a file copy which stays in the file, so you can see what actually happened. And the purpose of, with respect to, for instance, the bank accounts or anything where a request is made, when that is actually done, the document that actually does what we want to be done, like if, for instance, with a bank account, when you get a statement, it's going to show that it's owned by the trust. Well, the client is instructed by the funding document template, the documents that are produced, to take that document and put it behind the file copy in the 3-ring binder, so somebody reviewing the 3-ring binder could see that the client was instructed to retitle the asset and that actually happened based upon the documentation that's actually in the 3-ring binder. Retirement plans are also kept in the individual ownership. They're not owned by the trust. And again, the document that's produced by the funding letters template is a request that the beneficiary designation be verified by the custodian of the account. Savings bonds, the client's directed to have them retitled in the name of the trust. The same is true of oil, gas, mineral rights, which is amazingly, seem to be quite a few people that have these things. They own them. And there's a letter produced to whoever is in charge of the titling to that to request that they be retitled. And then you can have different types of personal property as well. Well, that's kind of basically how everything works. We're going to actually produce the documents, and then we'll come back and show you show you the examples of what the documents are actually produced in Word. Now let's go ahead and actually produce the documents. So we click Create Docs, and the trust spreadsheet is produced, and the trust funding docs is produced as well. And again, to save them, you just click and save them on your computer at the appropriate place. And then to open and review them, you would probably either go back to your file manager or go to the downloads and click to open them. So first we'll take a look at the spreadsheet. So this is the spreadsheet. And what it does is it organizes the assets that you've collected information on by type. So at the top would be real estate, and there are 2 different pieces of real estate in this case. So, and then the column to the right, well, the first column has information about the asset. The second column, ownership before funding, just states who owned it, who owns it currently. The next column, ownership after funding, shows who's contemplated to own it. Is it going to be owned by the trust? Will it be owned by John individually or Jane individually? The third column has a value, and every asset has a value. And then there are 4 columns to the right of value at funding: joint trust value, John's individual value, Jane's individual value, and joint individual value. And the value is spread to the appropriate column. So the value at funding of $254,013, because it's going into the joint trust, the property in Seaside, then it is spread over to the joint trust value. And that would be the same of all the different assets. Here's the timeshare. The personal property is going into joint trust. The safe deposit box is going into joint trust. The various accounts at Chase and at Vanguard are going into the joint trust. And the savings bonds, similarly to joint trust. The certificates held in stocks held in certificate form go to joint trust. The cars are going to joint trust, as is the airplane. The annuity, well, I made a mistake here. I put it into John and Jane's trust. I probably don't want to do that, so I'd probably go back and rerun this and put it into John individually. It does have a beneficiary designation, and it's shown here what it would be to the children, to the different trusts. And then the stock options are also going into trust. The promissory note into the trust. Closely held business into the trust, oil, gas, mineral rights into the trust. Insurance is going to stay individually owned. I made a mistake here. It's owned by John, but you see it got Jane, so I'd have to go back and fix that. Yeah, but it's got the beneficiary designation. It's owned by John. Jane is the individual, is the beneficiary, and then it would be the trust. Trust for the benefit of the children. The retirement, again, for some reason I screwed this up and have Jane as the owner after funding. It's supposed to be John, and John owns it, and Jane's the primary beneficiary. So if I were going to fix that, what I would do would be I would just go back to NACLI, go back. This is actually a good example of what happens here sometimes. So if I just went back to the funding fees explanatory material, and review it again, because it's going to also affect the funding documents. There's going to be errors in it because they got the wrong thing. So if I just go back to review or update and run it again, I can go back and change that. So if I go back to assets and look at it was one of the retirement accounts. This is insurance, the insurance policy owned by John. How will it be owned in the future? Jane. So fix that. No, I screwed up. John owns it. It's going to remain owned by John. So that's fixed. And then I think maybe the retirement was the same way. Yeah, John owns it, and it's going to continue to be owned by John. I think those were the two errors. So I say okay to that, and then I go ahead and create the documents. And I'm just going to save them again and overwrite the document I saved earlier. And then we'll take a look at it again and see if it's fixed. So let's go take a look at the spreadsheet again. We're going to save it back to the same place, overwrite the other one. Same with trust funding docs, save it, overwrite. Then go ahead and look at the downloads up here. And let's take a look at the spreadsheet again. See, this is the one we've fixed. So now if we go back and look at the insurance policy. Yeah, so now the insurance policy, John owns it individually before funding. He will own it afterwards. And the same is true of the retirement. John owns it individually before funding. John will own it individually after. And it does a total there. So it does all this math. Now, you might wonder, how is this happening? It's a Word document, but actually Word can do math. And so these templates are programmed to do math and to produce, you'll see a lot of that when we look, if you are a subscriber to the probate and trust administration, you'll see many examples of how Word can do math. Now let's go back and take a look at, let's go back to NACLI, let's take a look at the funding documents. So here's the latest funding document that has the correction in it. Let's see if this has any problems. A good idea is to, again, go to the navigation bar and hit the bracket. Are we going to get lucky? Oh, great. No matches. That means good. Every question is answered. So let's close up the navigation pane and kind of make it the view. We're going to make it one page and increase the zoom here a little bit so we can see it easier. Say to maybe 125. How's that look? Yeah, that's a little easier to read. And you'll see how this is the funding letters template, the document that's produced. And if you had taken the spreadsheet out of the three-ring binder and had it by your side, you could see that we're just going down the pages that follow in this document. They just track the assets as they are listed on the spreadsheet. And they provide more information. There's always at least one page like this for each asset. So if you looked at this information here, actually all of this information is contained in the spreadsheet because you knew from the spreadsheet that the asset was going to be owned by the joint trust. But what's different now here is there's more information about what's going to happen. Well, you see, it says, however, before John can transfer this real property, it's necessary to get the permission of the lender. While at the office, he signed a letter to the lender asking permission to transfer. Now you see, it knows that he owns it, that not Jane and John, just John owns it. It knows this. It's able to produce this very specialized information. And it tells him that after he gets a response from the lender, he should let us know so we can do a deed on this property. So if you turn to the next page, what you're going to see is the letter from John to the lender asking, I'm requesting permission, your permission as the secured lender to allow transfer of the subject property to the trust. So he'd sign that when he comes in, when they come in to sign all the documents. But if you go to the next page, there is a file copy, and we usually print these color printers, so it actually is in yellow. So if he took this letter out and mailed it, he'd still have in his three-ring binder, he would have the file copy. So he would know, what he wrote to Bank of America. And then he's instructed after he's notified, after receiving a response from the lender, he should three-hole punch the response and file it just after the copy of the letter. Well, so in other words, if we were looking at this letter, say he died, and we're trying to determine if he actually did get permission, we would just be turning the pages of the three-ring binder, and we'd go past, we'd see the file copy, we'd see that he was supposed to do this, then the very next page, you'd see, well, here's the letter from the lender giving permission or not giving permission. So it provides a way to verify, the funding document template provides a way to verify that the transfers actually occurred, because that's a big problem with trust funding, that people don't do what they're supposed to do. So you, for instance, could make a schedule to have the clients come back a year later and bring their binder and look at the binder and see pretend like you were the successor trustee, and see if there is documentation in the binder that shows that the transfers of ownership actually occurred like they were supposed to. Now, the second real estate, this is the one that is where this is the primary residence. So again, all this information here is in the spreadsheet, but then there's more. Now there's information. It says that they signed a deed. They also signed a letter to the insurance company asking the insurance company to add the trust as a named insured on the policy. Following the letter to the insurance company is a copy of the deed. We've sent the original deed in for recording. Well, so here is the letter to the insurance company that has the homeowner's policy, asking that please add the trust as an additional insured to the policy. And then there's a file copy. Well, when they get notice that the trust has been added as an insured, they're supposed to take that letter and three-hole punch it and put it right after the file copy, just documenting things. Now here's the deed. So here's the deed, and it's going to come back to the attorney. Remember we said that we wanted the deed returned by mail to the attorney after recording, and it's got the information. Remember, it's John Jones, not John A. Jones. So all this information's come into the deed, but they're conveying to John A. Jones and Jane A. Jones, co-trustees of the John and Jane Jones Trust, dated November 15, 2024, grantees. Here's all the information about the legal description that we entered into the questionnaire based upon the trio. So the deed's produced. They would sign the deed at the signing, be notarized. Timeshare. Well, here's an example of what would happen with the timeshare. Before this interest can be put in the trust, John and Jane will have to contact the association that manages the timeshare. So requesting forms. So here's a letter, and it's both, since they both own the asset, now it's John and Jane, and they are both signing this letter because that's owned jointly by them. The program knows to create a letter like that because we said it was owned jointly. And there's a file copy. Then there's personal property. Well, there's an assignment of personal property, which they would sign and get notarized. That's what puts the personal property into the ownership of the trust, an assignment. And you can have multiple properties, multiple personal properties going into the trust. Safety deposit box. Here's a letter to Chase, requesting that the ownership be changed to be so the owner is the trust, not the people. File copy. Then the accounts. They go through all the accounts. And here's a typical. It says they signed a letter requesting that the account be retitled. The original letter follows this page. You should either visit the bank or brokerage institution in person and show the bank employee the letter and the certification of trust. Well, after they've signed these letters and they leave the book for a while, and then paralegal will actually go in and make copies of the certification of trust that they signed, of the original, and put the copies right after this letter and put a paper clip up here. So they know that's an action point. They take that letter out, and attached to it is the certification of trust because the letter makes reference to a certification of trust being attached. Now, with respect to accounts that are local, they're actually instructed that perhaps the most efficient way to make this happen is not to actually mail a letter. In fact, they're told that even though letters are produced, they can accomplish the same result by a different means that's simpler. They're perfectly free to go ahead and do that. In fact, they might want to, rather than send a letter off to some far-flung bank, they might be wise to try and contact the bank by phone or on the internet, by chat or something, and find out exactly what paperwork the bank is going to require and actually start doing that way. So with respect to accounts that are local, what they would do is they'd go to make an appointment to go into the bank, take their 3-ring binder with them, and actually do the transferring in person at the bank. It's faster. Like the bank employee would type everything into the computer and they'd walk out of there, and then the accounts would have been retitled. So, but here's a letter. This is the letter to Chase for this checking account. There's one for each account. So if you just go through all these letters that follow, you see there's the second account, and then there'd be a letter and a file copy, and the third account, and a letter and a copy. And there could be multiple accounts. These would be accounts that are not retirement accounts. These are just bank accounts or brokerage accounts that are not part of a retirement plan. All the other assets have their own particular either instructions or letters that go along with it. Sometimes, you can see here, well, we didn't know the account number, so it's blank. So that's an example. It didn't call it an error that we didn't enter it, but it isn't there. So we probably might want to, go on. They could actually just handwrite it in here if they find out later. And again, CompuShare, maybe it would be more logical to contact CompuShare and find out what they want you to do to transfer the stock over. I have found that CompuShare is difficult to deal with. And then the cars and the airplane, all these things are, there's hardly, once in a while somebody has an airplane, not very common. Oh, I forgot to change the annuity. See, here we go. I wanted to make that continue to be owned by John, and see it screwed up. So, this is how it works. You look at these documents, you see there's a mistake, you go back and fix it and reprint that page. So that would be a good example here of kind of the process of how you would actually prepare these documents for signing. You have to go back and review them and make sure they make sense. And sometimes there's errors in formatting or something, and maybe it goes over to another page, you can edit all these documents. So you can either edit this one, or you can go back to the interview and change the answer and a contract where there's a promissory note. A business, same thing, an assignment is produced. Oil, gas, and mineral, letter to the custodian. Insurance policy, well, again, now see, all this information was in the spreadsheet. There's a letter produced as well. And so the letter is not asking that the insurance policy be retitled in the ownership of the trust, but rather it's just confirming the beneficiary designations. It's not, of course, the IRAs and the other types of retirement accounts cannot be owned by the trust. But we do want to make sure the beneficiary designation is correct, because that's part of estate planning too. We're trying to plan the transfer of all the assets, not just the assets in the trust, but all the assets. So that's what the spreadsheet does. Now the spreadsheet is invaluable because it's a very, I think a lot of times this never happens, where you have a clear picture. And we'll show you later, I'm going to go put this all together, show it exactly what the Deering binder looks like. In tab 10, there's another table, another page, where they're instructed that with respect to the spreadsheet, that any asset that they don't have, if they close an account, for example, they're instructed to take a pen and just draw a line through it on the spreadsheet and say closed and put the date. And then if they get a new account in tab 10, there's a place to enter that. And they're said, well, if you enter it in tab 10 and then later close it, you just do the same thing. You draw a line through it and say it's closed. So at any point in time, whoever is in charge of this trust should be able to, between the spreadsheet as edited and updated and the later acquired asset table, and also the insurance. And of course, this all becomes very, very important if a client becomes disabled and the successor trustee has to take over and manage the trust. Well, they have to know, what does the trust own? Similarly, at death, it's very important to have an up-to-date list of all the assets. And that's what the 3-ring binder is intended to do. It's intended to be a resource for the successor trustee to make the job of the successor trustee as easy as possible. Well, that concludes this video, rather long video. Again, I mean, if there's questions or if anybody has suggestions about things they'd like to do differently, feel free to contact me. I'm open to suggestions. Call me or email me, Richard Noble, 503-635-6235, and we will try and work with you on this. Thanks very much for watching this video.